Adjunct Professor Moran, Macroeconomics, Section 111, Macroeconomics 111. In our last session, we began our review sheet of the aggregate expense model, and we developed each variable separately. Consumption, including development of the margin propensity to consume and margin propensity to save. Gross private domestic investment, known as business spending. Government spending, and net exports. We added them up or aggregated them and discovered that the actual GDP in the economy is 146. Then we compared that with full employment level of output, and we discovered we had an inflationary gap, that our level of output, our actual level of 146, exceeded 125. The 121, our full employment level of output. So we had, since actual exceeded full employment, we have an inflationary gap. And we used, the government was going to solve this by using spending, then taxes, and then a balanced budget multiplier to cause a shift in the actual line, to drop it down on top of the full employment line, causing a disequilibrium, which the invisible hand would take over business spending and income, change in income, and return us to equilibrium. Now we're going to use the same actual number of 146, but we're going to have a recessionary equilibrium. So here we're going to assume that full employment is at 170. So the number of workers hired is 170, but the GDP is read from the GDP column. So we've got 171 gross domestic product full employment, and our actual GDP was 146, which we developed in the prior session. Any number on the 45-degree reference line is the same on both axes. This is aggregate expenditures actual, and this will be aggregate expenditures full employment. Since full employment GDP is larger than our actual, we have a recessionary equilibrium here. So this distance, the distance between these two lines, which is the same for the entire long length, is known as a recessionary gap. The gap will be found here, but we'll be using it over here. We'll cause the equilibrium over here. But if this is 171, this is 168.5. We want this line to drop down by 2.5. That'll be the recessionary gap. Okay, is this an inflationary or recessionary gap? This is a recessionary gap. Assuming the government wanted to restore the full economy to full employment, what should it do? Increase taxes or decrease spending? That's contractionary, meant to fight inflation. They should decrease taxes and increase spending. That's expansionary, meant to fight a recession. By increasing spending, the government will directly contribute to the purchase of GDP, which businesses will then hire more workers to produce that GDP. Income will go up and consumption will go up. And then those workers will have money to spend, and that'll ripple throughout the economy. Or the government can lower taxes. Personal income minus taxes is disposable income, which is then either consumed or saved. Lowering taxes will cause disposable income to rise, causing consumption and savings to rise. How much would the government need to increase or decrease spending to fight this recessionary gap? What's the marginal propensity to consume? From the original session, we determined that the marginal propensity to consume was 0.9. Every time income changed by 10, consumption changed by 9. That's 0.9. The multiplier is 1 over the marginal propensity to save. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, the marginal propensity to save is 1 minus 0.9, or 0.1. Or you can determine it by taking the change in savings. When income changes by 10, savings was changing by 1, it's 0.1. So So the multiplier is 1 over 0.1 equals 10. For every time the government changes spending by $1, GDP will change by 10. What is the amount of the gap? 2.5. 171, and the line that we are on at that disequilibrium would be 168.5. The gap is 2.5. If the government changes the spending by the amount of the gap, what will the resulting change to GDP be? The formula is change in GDP equals the change in aggregate expenditures, in this case government spending, times the spending multiplier. The change in GDP will be equal to 2.5 times the spending multiplier of 10, which equals 25. I do this to point out that with change in spending only, if the government changes spending by the amount of the gap, they will drop this line sufficiently, which will then restore us to full employment. It will not work for change in taxes or the balanced budget multiplier. The way to do this, on the other hand, is really the change in GDP is equal to the change in aggregate expenditures times the spending multiplier. We know that we want GDP to change by 25. From 146 to 171 is a change of GDP of 25. We want to determine how much of a change in government spending would be required to accomplish that. Change in aggregate expenditures, and we know the multiplier is 10. Dividing both sides by 10, you get a change in government spending required of 2.5. They would increase this line from 146 to 148.5. And what would happen? There's a disequilibrium. The government spending would cause us to increase to this point. And there's a disequilibrium where making, aggregate expenditures can be thought of as buying, not making. And GDP can be thought of as making or output and income. Since we're on this side of the 45-degree reference line, buying is greater than making. There will be an unplanned inventory decrease, which is good for business because they're selling more than they thought. As a result, they'll produce more. To do that, they'll have to hire more workers. Unemployment will fall. Income will rise. Income is the primary determinant of consumption. Consumption will rise, but not dollar for dollar, since the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9. For every dollar increase of income, they will spend 90 cents and keep it going. That 0.9 is the slope of the aggregate expense line. It's the marginal propensity to consume. It's 0.9. What was the discrepancy between the two GDPs? 25. After the government changes its spending by 2.5, what will the difference be? 0. The government will restore the economy to full employment by shifting the aggregate expense line up by spending 2.5 more. They create this disequilibrium, and then the invisible hand takes over and restores us to equilibrium. And so actual and GDP will be the same at 170. If, though, the government wanted to accomplish this with a change in taxes, how much would this have? What would result? What would be the difference? In order to do that, we need to know the marginal propensity consumed and the marginal propensity to save, because the tax multiplier is a negative marginal propensity consumed divided by the marginal propensity to save. The marginal propensity consumed is 0.9, the marginal propensity to save was 0.1. A negative 0.9 divided by 0.1 is negative 9. The tax multiplier is always one less than the spending multiplier, and a negative. So here, the multiplier turned out to be 10. Negative 9. What is the recessionary gap? 2.5. Multiply the change in taxes by the tax multiplier. So we'll take 9 times and we'll get a total change in GDP of 22.5. How much did we need GDP to change by? 25. We're 2.5 off. We're 2.5 short because the tax multiplier is not as powerful as the spending multiplier of 10. That's because the first round of spending, when the government changes spending, does in fact count as GDP. If they build a building or they buy defense equipment, that counts. But when the government changes taxes, that's a transfer payment, which is excluded from GDP. And so the first round in a change in taxes does not count. So it will be less affected by a factor of 1. Since the factor in this case is 2.5, the gap, we won't make it. We'll only get 22.5 instead of 25. So now let's figure out how much we have to change taxes by in order to accomplish our goal. The change in GDP will equal the change in taxes times the tax multiplier. We know we want GDP to change by 25. We need to solve for the government's change in taxes. We know the tax multiplier is a negative 9. So we're going to take 25, the change desired in GDP, and divide it by 9. And it comes out to 2.8. The government's going to have to reduce taxes 2.8. So let's solve the problem. How much does GDP change by if we reduce taxes by 2.8? A negative tax change of negative 2.8 times a negative 9 gives us positive 25. GDP will change by 25 if the government reduces taxes by 2.8. It has to be larger than the change in spending because the tax multiplier is not as great, because some of this will leak out into savings and not be as stimulative as the change in government spending. Finally, if the Congress passes a balanced budget multiplier, how much will the government have to change spending? Well, let's find out. Okay, the amount of the gap again is 2.5. Multiply the balanced budget multiplier by the gap. 1 times 2.5 equals 2.5. Why didn't this restore the economy to full employment? We needed this change to be 25. It didn't restore to the economy to full employment because a balanced budget multiplier, if we want to fight recession, we need to increase G, but a balance which is expansionary. But the change in taxes, which would have to go up to match the increase in government spending because the balanced budget multiplier is contractionary. Increase in taxes reduces disposable income. So this will expand the economy by 10, but this will contract the economy by 1. All that's left is the original round. 1 round, and each round would be worth 2.5, the gap. How much would the government have to change spending to restore the economy to full employment? Change in GDP equals change in G and T times the balanced budget multiplier. Balanced budget multiplier is 1. We need GDP to change by 25. How much would change in G and T have to be if the multiplier is 1? The government would have to lift the whole weight. They would have to change the entire amount of the recessionary GDP level, which would be 25. So again, this is not a practical thing to do economically, because the government would lose control over how to manage the economy because these gaps between potential and actual GDP are large. So it would be an unintended consequence of passing a balanced budget amendment, which some people propose because the government seems to have a hard time not spending more money than they take in, resulting in chronic deficits. This has been a review of our unit on aggregate expenditures, and the 2 videos have gone over all the details from the start of the unit to the conclusion of the unit.